Hammurabi, was recorded in historical documentation as the sixth king of the first dynasty of Babylon, ruling during the first half of the 18th century BCE, according to the middle chronology commonly used by modern scholars. My birth is estimated to have occurred around 1810 BCE. Although this date cannot be determined with absolute certainty, synchronisms derived from diplomatic tablets, royal inscriptions, and administrative records allow historians to approximate the period in which I was born. My lineage is rooted in the Amorite tribal groups that had migrated into Mesopotamia centuries earlier and established themselves as part of the political landscape. Therefore, my identity represents a synthesis of Amorite tribal heritage and the long-standing Sumerian-Akkadian cultural and administrative traditions that had shaped Mesopotamia for millennia before my reign. My father, Sin-Muballit, served as the fifth king of the first dynasty of Babylon. During his rule, Babylon was not yet the dominant political power of Mesopotamia. Instead, it functioned as one of several regional states competing for influence. The geopolitical environment of the era was defined by rival kingdoms such as Larsa under Rim-Sin, Eshnunna in the Diyala region, Mari along the middle Euphrates, and the city-state of Ashur to the north. My father sought to strengthen Babylon's position through controlled administrative reforms, selective military engagements, and diplomatic initiatives. As a result, my upbringing was not limited to the general education of a royal child, it was structured to prepare me for leadership in a fragmented and competitive regional order. The details of my childhood are not fully documented in extant sources. However, based on the conventional structure of royal education in Mesopotamian palace institutions, it is possible to infer the general framework in which I was trained. From an early age, I was introduced to cuneiform literacy in the Akkadian and Sumerian languages, as these were essential for reading administrative records, legal precedents, agricultural accounts, economic ledgers, and religious texts. The palace scribes oversaw the process of instruction, ensuring that I acquired the skills necessary to interpret and produce complex written documents. Literacy was foundational to governance, because state administration depended on written communication, standardized record-keeping, tax documentation, and legal codification. In addition to literacy, my early education included exposure to subjects relevant to state management, including irrigation practices, agricultural production cycles, land measurement procedures, resource allocation, and population labor organization. Mesopotamia's economic stability relied on the coordination of water resources across extensive canal networks, the regulation of agricultural lands, and the distribution of grain reserves. A ruler had to understand the technical nature of these systems to ensure continuity of production and to manage risks associated with drought, flooding, and seasonal irregularities. My instructors emphasized these principles not as theoretical knowledge but as practical tools for governance. I also studied the operational framework of palace and temple bureaucracies. Temples were major economic institutions that managed herds, fields, workshops, storage facilities, and labor forces. Their administrative reasoning, accounting structures, and production systems were inseparable from the governance of the state. As a result, I analyzed the economic tablets documenting temple land leases, labor rotations, commodity rations, and agricultural obligations. These records formed part of the technical foundation upon which state control over resources was established. Because the Mesopotamian king was responsible for maintaining political order and ritual stability, I received instruction in the formal aspects of Mesopotamian religion. This training did not pertain to personal belief or emotional engagement. rather, it consisted of learning the procedural requirements for managing cultic institutions, conducting festival cycles, authorizing offerings, overseeing divination activities, and ensuring the proper coordination between temples and state authorities. Rituals operated as structured mechanisms for legitimizing governance and reinforcing societal stability, and therefore they were included in my technical preparation for kingship. I studied the roles of priests, diviners, temple administrators, and ritual specialists to understand how religious institutions integrated with administrative priorities. During my youth, I had the opportunity to observe the geopolitical dynamics affecting Babylon and surrounding states. Reports supplied by palace scribes and messengers provided updates regarding troop movements, diplomatic exchanges, resource disputes, and alliances across the region. The struggle for regional dominance during this period was characterized by shifting coalitions, border conflicts, the seizure of trade routes, and competition for control of river systems and irrigation zones. My father's administration used both negotiation and military readiness to secure Babylon's position, and my education included examination of these strategies. I was trained in military organization and operational planning. This included instruction in infantry formations, chariot operations, siege technologies, defensive fortifications, reconnaissance networks, and logistical coordination. Mesopotamian warfare required precise calculation of resource availability, manpower distribution, supply chain maintenance, and strategic positioning. My instructors detailed the technical characteristics of battering rams, siege towers, shield formations, wall breach procedures, and defensive countermeasures. Learning these systems was essential because a ruler's military capability influenced diplomatic negotiations, economic leverage, and administrative stability. Another critical element of my training involved legal traditions. Before my reign, rulers across Mesopotamia had issued legal decrees, debt remission orders, and administrative regulations. I studied earlier law collections, judicial records, legal disputes, court procedures, and written contracts. Through these documents, I examined property laws, commercial practices, marriage regulations, inheritance cases, labor obligations, and penalties for economic misconduct. The study of law provided me with a structured understanding of dispute resolution and administrative order, which later influenced the comprehensive legal codification I promulgated. Cultural education also played a role. I analyzed Sumerian literary traditions, including temple hymns, royal inscriptions, lexical lists, economic tablets, and mythological narratives. My training prioritized the technical and administrative content of these works rather than their poetic or symbolic significance. I examined them as historical documents that demonstrated earlier governance structures, bureaucratic processes, and cultural standards across Mesopotamia. Understanding earlier periods enabled me to assess long-term administrative trends and institutional developments. As an Amorite, I was also educated about the socio-political traditions of my ancestral tribal groups, including lineage structures, clan leadership patterns, and patterns of migration into Mesopotamia. These elements were relevant to the socio-political identity of Babylon, because Amorite elites had integrated into the administrative order of Mesopotamian city-states and contributed to the political restructuring of the early 2nd millennium BCE. Linguistic training constituted another major aspect of my education. Akkadian served as the lingua franca of interstate diplomacy, economic communication, and bureaucratic record-keeping. Proficiency in Akkadian was required to read correspondence from foreign rulers, issue administrative orders, and review legal or economic documentation. Sumerian literacy remained important because the language continued to be used in religious and scholarly contexts. Mastery of both languages allowed me to interact effectively with scribes, administrators, and diplomatic envoys. Throughout this period, I engaged directly with advisors, generals, economic overseers, scribes, and temple administrators, ensuring that my education remained practical rather than theoretical. My training was intended to produce a ruler capable of analyzing political conditions, evaluating military risks, administering taxation systems, supervising resource distribution, and maintaining legal and ritual order. The emphasis on analytical reasoning and institutional knowledge formed the basis for my later decisions in governance, warfare, diplomacy, and legislative reform. By the time I reached adulthood, my identity had been shaped not merely by familial lineage but by a comprehensive system of technical training. This training encompassed the full administrative spectrum of an early Mesopotamian state: economic management, legal oversight, military coordination, diplomatic strategy, temple administration, resource allocation, and infrastructural maintenance. The combination of Amorite heritage and Mesopotamian institutional knowledge positioned me to assume leadership at a time when the region was fragmented and required calculated strategies to stabilize and expand Babylon's influence. My origins therefore reflect a convergence of cultural, political, and technical elements, rather than any form of emotional or personal narrative. Each component of my education served to prepare me for the structural demands of ruling a state in a competitive geopolitical environment. The methods I learned during my formative years later played a measurable and documented role in shaping my administrative reforms, legal codification, military strategies, and diplomatic policies. My early training therefore represents the foundational phase of my reign, establishing the analytical framework through which I approached governance and statecraft. I, Hammurabi, ascended to the throne of Babylon in 1792 BCE, according to the chronological framework most widely referenced by modern historians. Although exact dates vary slightly across different chronologies, the political and administrative documents that have survived from the period confirm that my accession occurred during a time when Babylon was not yet the dominant power of Mesopotamia. Instead, it existed as one of several medium-sized regional states competing within a dynamic and unstable geopolitical environment. The process of my rise was not the result of personal ambition or emotional determination, rather, it was the outcome of a calculated sequence of administrative strengthening, diplomatic strategy, and military preparation executed over several decades. In this section, I will explain the technical and historical components of this process from my own perspective, without dramatization or subjective emphasis. 1. Internal consolidation and administrative foundation. Upon assuming the throne, I identified internal consolidation as the essential first step of my governance strategy. A Mesopotamian state could not sustain military expansion or diplomatic influence without a stable administrative core. Therefore, the early years of my rule were dedicated to strengthening the mechanisms of governance, standardizing bureaucratic procedures, and ensuring consistent control over key economic resources. One of my initial actions involved reforming the tax administration. Agricultural output records were reorganized, labor quotas for canal maintenance were recalculated, and temple-based economic systems were required to submit standardized reports. This was necessary because the economic capacity of Babylon depended on consistent grain production, irrigation network efficiency, and predictable labor contributions. The administrative apparatus inherited from my predecessors lacked uniformity, resulting in inefficiencies and local discrepancies. I instructed the scribal bureaucracy to implement regular auditing procedures and to record economic transactions with greater precision. It was also necessary to centralize authority over regional elites. Although these local leaders formally recognized the authority of the Babylonian king, they often exercised a degree of autonomous control over their agricultural lands, labor resources, and local security forces. Such autonomy posed a risk to long-term stability. To mitigate this, I strengthened the palace bureaucracy and required regional administrators to submit detailed written reports. By expanding the responsibilities of palace scribes, I reduced the influence of semi-independent elites and brought resource management under central oversight. 2. Political environment during my youth. My rise cannot be understood without reference to the geopolitical landscape during my formative years. Throughout my youth, the southern kingdom of Larsa, under the long reign of Rim-Sin, exercised economic dominance across portions of lower Mesopotamia. To the east, Eshnunna controlled the Diyala River basin and held strategic positions along vital trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Zagros highlands. Mari, to the west, functioned as an important diplomatic hub and regulated trade along the Middle Euphrates. Meanwhile, Ashur remained a regional power to the north, occasionally asserting political pressure but often maintaining a cautious stance. These conditions shaped my early analytical understanding of statecraft. I examined intelligence reports provided by messengers and scribes, studied the consequences of territorial conflicts among the major powers, and assessed the long-term effects of trade disruptions and irrigation disputes. These observations helped form the strategic foundation upon which my later decisions were based. 3. Diplomacy as a strategic tool. Throughout the first decade of my rule, I prioritized diplomacy over direct military action. Engaging in immediate expansion would have risked confrontation with Larsa, Eshnunna, or another major power at a time when Babylon was not yet prepared for sustained conflict. Instead, my strategy involved reshaping the regional balance of power through alliances, intelligence sharing, and controlled political cooperation. My most significant diplomatic relationship during this period was with Zimri-Lim, king of Mari. The Mari archives, preserved through archaeological excavation, confirm the depth of this alliance. Hundreds of clay tablets document the exchange of intelligence, mutual consultations on military threats, and agreements related to resource protection. This alliance allowed Babylon to monitor the actions of rival states, especially Eshnunna, whose ambitions in the Diyala region threatened the stability of the broader geopolitical system. Diplomacy allowed me to prevent hostile coalitions from forming and to ensure that Babylon would not become isolated. By cultivating relationships with multiple regional states, I preserved strategic flexibility while gradually strengthening the administrative and military foundations of my kingdom. 4. Military preparation and structural reorganization. Although I did not initiate major military campaigns during the earliest phase of my reign, I engaged in a systematic process of reorganizing the Babylonian army. Mesopotamian warfare required technical skill across multiple domains: siege, engineering, infantry coordination, chariot operations, logistics, and reconnaissance. Therefore, my reforms were multi-layered and aimed at enhancing operational efficiency. The first component of this reform involved upgrading siege equipment. The construction of standardized battering rams, wooden assault towers, and protective siege shelters, used to shield soldiers approaching fortified walls, was expanded. I ordered inspections of fortress defenses across Babylonian territory and ensured that garrisons received the necessary provisions to maintain readiness. Logistical organization was another priority. Military campaigns in Mesopotamia depended on careful planning regarding food distribution, water access, transport routes, and pack animals. To improve this system, I established grain storage facilities at strategic intervals along major travel routes and mapped reliable water sources across the regions where future campaigns might occur. Reconnaissance operations were improved through coordinated intelligence networks. With assistance from Mari, we developed a bilateral communication system in which updates regarding enemy troop movements, political negotiations, and emerging threats were shared promptly between our courts. Garrison deployment was standardized as well. Instead of withdrawing forces immediately after securing a region, I deployed permanent military contingents to maintain control, collect taxes, and manage local disputes. This approach ensured that newly acquired territories would not revert to rebellion or fall under external influence. 5. Roles I assumed during my rise. My rise involved assuming several interconnected roles, each necessary for the governance structure of an emerging Mesopotamian state. 1. Head of state. As king, I coordinated administrative, legal, economic, and military institutions, ensuring unified governance. 2. Military commander. I designed operational strategies, managed troop mobilization, and directed siege procedures during active campaigns. 3. Legislative authority. I issued decrees that regulated debt, land use, taxation, labor obligations, and administrative responsibilities. These efforts laid the groundwork for later codification of a comprehensive legal system. 4. Economic regulator. I monitored agricultural production, trade routes, irrigation systems, and temple assets to maintain economic stability. 5. Diplomatic actor. I engaged with regional rulers to form alliances, negotiate territorial claims, and manage collective security concerns. These roles formed the institutional framework through which my rise progressed. They also illustrate that my ascent was not the result of a singular event, but a structured process integrating governance, economics, military planning, and diplomacy. 6. Early administrative reforms. During the first decade of my rule, I implemented several reforms that strengthened Babylon internally. These reforms were not developed for symbolic purposes, they were technical responses to structural weaknesses identified within the existing administrative system. Key reforms included debt regulation decrees. These were intended to stabilize the agricultural economy by preventing excessive accumulation of private debt, which could reduce labor productivity. Standardization of temple and palace accounting. Uniform accounting requirements ensured transparency and prevented local administrators from manipulating resources. Revised land measurement records. Precise land documentation improved tax assessment accuracy and facilitated irrigation planning. Irrigation labor restructuring. Workforce obligations were reorganized to ensure consistent maintenance of canals and embankments. Enforcement of central oversight. Local elites were required to comply with bureaucratic procedures, reducing the risks of regional separatism or resource mismanagement. These reforms increased the state's administrative capacity and ensured that Babylon would be able to support future military and diplomatic initiatives. 7. Transformation of regional power dynamics. As my administrative and diplomatic strategies progressed, the regional power balance began to shift. Eshnuna's territorial expansions created tensions with both Mari and Ashur, while Larsa continued to face resource limitations despite Rimsin's long reign. These conditions provided opportunities for Babylon to strengthen its position without exposing itself to premature military conflict. Because major powers were engaged in disputes with one another, Babylon was able to expand its influence through controlled interventions, strategic alliances, and the exploitation of temporary political weaknesses across the region. 8. The final phase of my rise, transition toward expansion. After approximately a decade and a half of administrative and diplomatic groundwork, Babylon possessed enough military and economic stability to initiate controlled expansion. This transition was not based on spontaneous decision-making, it was the result of cumulative technical assessments, including Eshnunna's vulnerability due to resource strain, the importance of securing Mari as an intelligence and trade partner, the gradual weakening of Larsa despite its territorial size, the inconsistent foreign policy posture of Ashur. Each factor contributed to a strategic calculation that expansion could now be pursued with manageable risk. My rise therefore represents a multi-stage progression involving internal consolidation, diplomatic cooperation, military restructuring, and eventual territorial acquisition. By the time this process was complete, Babylon was positioned to shift from a regional participant to a major geopolitical actor. The next phases of my reign, defined by warfare, reform, and administrative transformation, were built directly upon the foundations established during this period of structured ascent. During the later years of my reign, the principal challenge I faced involved the shifting balance of power across Mesopotamia and the necessity of reorganizing this balance in a manner that aligned with the long-term security and administrative stability of Babylon. The military campaigns, diplomatic decisions, and legal reforms I implemented were not isolated responses to individual events but components of a unified, calculated strategy. The developments described here represent the technical processes through which state expansion, resource protection, and administrative integration were achieved. The explanation that follows reflects the analytical reasoning behind each action, without emotional emphasis or narrative dramatization. At the beginning of this period, Babylon occupied an intermediate position among regional states. The pressures exerted by Eshnunna from the east, Larsa from the south, and occasionally Ashur from the north restricted the state's mobility and threatened its access to economically essential trade routes and irrigation networks. The competition for control of water systems, agricultural production centers, and transport corridors shaped the political dynamics of all states in the region. Therefore, territorial expansion constituted a technical requirement rather than an ideological objective. It was necessary to secure stable agricultural output, maintain uninterrupted trade, and limit the ability of rival states to interfere with the internal administration of Babylon. The first major military initiative of my later reign targeted Eshnunna. This state controlled the Diyala region, thereby influencing the trade pathways connecting central Mesopotamia with the Zagros highlands and the resource zones beyond. Because Eshnunna possessed fortified settlements and organized infantry units, a direct attack without preparation would have produced excessive logistical strain. Consequently, the operation depended on preliminary analysis of supply lines, troop endurance, and strategic positioning. My generals and engineers prepared detailed reports on the placement of wells, natural streams, and seasonal water supplies across the planned route of advance, because a Mesopotamian army relied primarily on the predictability of nearby water sources. Grain depots were stocked along the northern corridor, and supply carts were reallocated to ensure consistent movement capacity. Siege equipment underwent inspection and reinforcement. Chariot teams received additional animals to maintain speed during extended marches. These were purely functional decisions designed to prevent operational failures. The initial phase of the Eshnunna campaign involved the capture of advanced outposts positioned along the frontier. These locations did not possess significant troop concentrations, so their seizure required small-scale tactical maneuvers rather than extended combat. The primary objective was to disrupt Eshnunna's forward surveillance network and restrict their army's ability to track Babylonian troop movements. Once this objective was met, the operation shifted toward the main stronghold. The capital of Eshnunna was protected by multi-layered fortifications and wide defensive ditches. Siege procedures relied on battering rams constructed from reinforced timber, ladder units designed for vertical assault, and protective shelters that enabled soldiers to approach the walls under cover. The technical execution of the siege depended on synchronized infantry movements and calculated timing of assaults, combined with efforts to deny the city access to external supplies. When the city fell, the strategic effect was immediate. Babylon acquired control of the Diyala corridor and eliminated a major eastern competitor. This outcome altered the geopolitical landscape of Mesopotamia by extending Babylonian influence across regions that had previously been contested. The next significant opponent was Larsa, a state with long-established control over southern agricultural zones and extensive irrigation systems. The long reign of Rimsin had allowed Larsa to maintain economic dominance in the lower region of Mesopotamia, making it a necessary target from the perspective of resource acquisition and long-term administrative security. Because Larsa maintained strong defensive networks and hydrological infrastructure, the campaign required an incremental approach that weakened the state in stages. The northern cities under Larsa's authority were the first targets. These cities possessed moderate defenses but were economically interconnected with the southern core. Capturing them allowed Babylon to disrupt Larsa's tax base and agricultural supply chain. The method used in these operations was not centered on prolonged siege warfare, rather, it involved tactical positioning, the demonstration of superior force, and the inducement of surrender by local officials aware of their vulnerable situation. The reorganization of administrative structures in these cities began immediately after their capture to ensure continuity of production and prevent further unrest. Subsequent operations concentrated on the agricultural storage zones that formed the economic foundation of Larsa's power. Controlling grain reserves reduced Larsa's capacity to supply its own garrisons and curtailed its ability to fund extended resistance. This stage of the campaign required a combination of military pressure and logistical reallocation, not only to capture the storage sites but also to preserve their structural integrity for future Babylonian use. The final phase targeted the capital of Larsa. By this stage, Rimsin's political network showed signs of exhaustion, and the cumulative economic disruptions undermined the city's ability to sustain its defensive posture. The capture of Larsa resulted in the transfer of the entire southern agricultural system, including irrigation works, land leases, labor obligations, and temple estates, under Babylonian administrative authority. Once integrated, these assets significantly expanded the resource capacity of the state and provided the economic base required for further reforms. Military victories required corresponding administrative measures to ensure stability. Immediately after territorial acquisition, I placed garrisons in strategic positions, replaced local governors when necessary, and integrated temple economies into the Babylonian accounting system. Standardized procedures for tax collection, irrigation, Labor and judicial oversight were introduced. These steps removed the possibility of local autonomy that could threaten long-term control. As territories were consolidated, I initiated legal and economic reforms to reorganize the functioning of the expanded state. These measures included restructured land distribution principles, regulations governing labor obligations, and standardized penalties for violations involving irrigation systems, theft, contract disputes, and agricultural negligence. The objective of these reforms was to eliminate legal inconsistencies and ensure uniformity across all regions under Babylonian rule. A state cannot maintain cohesion if its legal environment differs from one city to another. Therefore, codification of laws was a necessary technical step. The most extensive legal undertaking of my reign was the compilation of a large set of statutes that modern historians refer to as the Laws of Hammurabi. Although this text is associated with my name, its content derives from a long tradition of Mesopotamian jurisprudence. Earlier systems, including the laws of Uarnamu and Lipitishtar, were examined and used as precedents. My legal reforms extended the scope of regulation to include not only civil disputes but also administrative responsibilities, professional conduct, property rights, commercial agreements, and penalties for negligence. By codifying these principles in written form, I ensured that judges across the state followed consistent procedures. This consistency reduced the likelihood of arbitrary rulings and facilitated efficient dispute resolution. The development of these laws was not a symbolic act but an administrative mechanism that supported the integration of newly conquered regions. Local populations were required to operate under uniform standards, making it easier for governors to enforce regulations. The detailed prescriptions in the laws, for example, those related to irrigation, agriculture, rental agreements, and penalties for damage, reflected the technical needs of a society dependent on land productivity and hydrological management. Because agriculture formed the backbone of Babylon's economy, maintaining irrigation integrity was essential, and legal penalties served as preventive measures. Debt remission decrees were issued periodically to prevent systemic collapse caused by excessive financial burdens on small landholders. These decrees, known as Mesarim orders, extinguished certain categories of debt and returned individuals to their original economic positions. The purpose of these measures was not moral but economic. Unchecked debt accumulation could reduce agricultural labor availability, weaken tax revenue, and destabilize social order. Therefore, remission decrees functioned as corrective mechanisms within the broader administrative system. Following the campaigns against Larsa and Nishnana, my interactions with Ashur required a different strategy. Unlike the previous two states, Ashur was not an immediate threat but a potential long-term competitor. Direct conquest would have required a costly campaign across difficult terrain, providing limited economic advantage. Instead, I opted for a controlled relationship in which Ashur remained autonomous but strategically constrained. By regulating trade, monitoring diplomatic exchanges, and maintaining garrisons near key border points, I preserved Babylon's dominance without engaging in unnecessary conflict. This approach illustrates the principle that military action was only one element of my strategic arsenal and was employed selectively. The administration of justice and enforcement of economic regulations were strengthened across the expanding state. Judicial procedures became more standardized, and penalties were adjusted to reflect the increased complexity of a larger bureaucracy. Because population centers differed in economic structure, temple wealth, and agricultural layout, uniform legal enforcement ensured that regional diversity did not evolve into political fragmentation. This controlled legal environment formed the backbone of Babylon's internal order. In addition to military and legal reforms, I reorganized labor distribution across the state. Canal maintenance required coordinated efforts from multiple settlements. These projects were scheduled and documented, with each region assigned specific quotas. Failure to fulfill these quotas resulted in penalties, because irrigation breakdowns could negatively affect regions far beyond the initial point of damage. By strictly regulating labor distribution, I prevented disruptions in agricultural productivity and protected the state from recurring risks of drought or flooding. I also adjusted economic monitoring of temples and estates. Because temple institutions controlled significant landholdings, livestock, and labor, they influenced the state's overall economic capacity. By requiring detailed accounting reports and imposing oversight on temple administrators, I integrated temple economies into the broader state structure. This reduced the likelihood of resource misallocation and improved tax revenue accuracy. The cumulative effect of these measures transformed Babylon into the most powerful and administratively sophisticated state in Mesopotamia. The territorial expansions provided control over irrigation systems and agricultural zones, the legal reforms standardized governance across regions, and the economic restructuring increased the efficiency of production and taxation. The combination of these actions reflects a comprehensive system in which military operations, administrative reforms, and legal codification function together. The events described are components of a singular strategic framework. Military campaigns disrupted rival powers and secured essential resources. Administrative regulations ensured stability in annexed regions. Legal codification established uniform procedures. Economic adjustments preserved productivity. Each measure reinforced the others, producing a unified structure capable of sustaining long-term dominance. My reign therefore represents a period in which expansion and reform were coordinated systematically, allowing Babylon to achieve a level of influence unmatched by earlier regional states. Throughout my reign, the works attributed to me were not artistic creations in the modern sense but institutional, administrative, legal, and infrastructural systems designed to stabilize and expand the capacity of the Babylonian state. The objective of these works was not to express personal identity or to construct symbolic representations, but to create technical solutions for the functioning of a large and complex administrative apparatus. The most well-known of these works is the legal corpus that modern scholars refer to as the Laws of Hammurabi. However, this text represents only one component of a broader set of reforms, regulations, infrastructural improvements, and standardized administrative practices that constitute the full scope of my contributions. The legal corpus was produced to unify diverse legal traditions across the territories. Under my authority, different cities in Mesopotamia had long maintained their own customs, judicial precedents, and administrative procedures. Without a single standardized system, judicial decisions varied significantly between regions, leading to inconsistency and inefficiency. The legal text I ordered to be compiled addressed this issue by establishing uniform rules and penalties that would apply throughout the state. It consisted of approximately 280 provisions covering a wide range of administrative and social situations, debt relations, agricultural responsibilities, theft, property disputes, contractual obligations, rental agreements, labor arrangements, medical liability, marriage and inheritance practices, and commercial transactions. These provisions were not created to express philosophical principles or moral beliefs. They were practical measures designed to regulate predictable categories of disputes and to support the operation of the state. Each clause defined a specific scenario and provided an explicit outcome, eliminating ambiguity in judicial interpretation. This ensured that judges were bound by predetermined standards rather than subjective decision-making. The legal text also clarified the penalties for negligence in irrigation, damage to agricultural fields, failure to maintain embankments, and other activities that had direct effects on economic productivity. Because the Babylonian economy relied heavily on agriculture, and because agricultural productivity depended on the maintenance of canal systems, the legal provisions served as a system of technical enforcement for essential public works. In preparing this legal corpus, scribes studied earlier law codes including those of Ur, Nammu, Lipitishtar, and other rulers of the Isan-Larsa period. These earlier texts contained basic categories of legal reasoning, but their scope was limited to the specific conditions of their respective city-states. My legal text expanded those frameworks to address the administrative needs of a much larger territorial state, integrating multiple regions with divergent traditions. The final result was not a philosophical treatise but a functional document intended for continuous administrative application. Beyond the legal corpus, one of my most significant sets of works involved the reorganization and maintenance of irrigation systems. Mesopotamian agriculture depended entirely on irrigation, and the failure of any canal segment could weaken production across large areas. Therefore, I ordered large-scale engineering efforts to clean canals, reinforce embankments, excavate channels, and redirect watercourses where necessary. These projects were documented in technical reports prepared by engineers and overseers. The reports contain details on labor quantities, soil displacement, wall reinforcement techniques, and irrigation flow rate measurements. These records allowed the state to evaluate the performance of workers and to determine whether maintenance obligations were being carried out effectively. These irrigation projects were accompanied by legal provisions specifying responsibility for negligence. If a farmer failed to maintain a dike and this caused flooding that damaged another person's field, the law mandated compensation according to predetermined standards. Similarly, if an individual caused accidental damage by improperly conducting irrigation, the law prescribed precise penalties. These provisions were not moral judgments, they were measures designed to prevent failures in water management that could reduce agricultural output and consequently diminish the supply base on which the state depended. Through this system, engineering requirements were linked directly to legal enforcement, creating a coordinated structure of agricultural protection. Another category of work produced during my reign consisted of administrative reforms applied to temple economies. Temples held substantial land, labor forces, herds, and storage facilities. Because of this, they functioned as major economic institutions rather than purely religious entities. I required temple administrators to submit standardized accounting records, including inventory lists, ration distribution data, and production reports. These records were reviewed by government auditors to ensure accuracy. By standardizing temple accounting, I aligned the economic output of the temples with the resource needs of the state. This process reduced mismanagement and ensured predictable taxation and labor obligations. As part of the broader reorganization of the state, I also commissioned infrastructural works in Babylon and other major cities. These projects included the reinforcement of city walls, the expansion of storage facilities, the improvement of roads, and the Construction or renovation of key administrative buildings. The purpose of these works was operational rather than ceremonial. Strengthened walls improved defensive readiness. Expanded storage capacity allowed for better regulation of grain reserves. Improved roads enabled faster troop movement and facilitated trade. Administrative buildings provided space for bureaucratic processing, enabling more efficient handling of records. These projects represented structural investments designed to support the growing demands of a larger state. In addition to infrastructural works, I also oversaw the regulation and improvement of measurement systems used in trade. Standardized weights and measures were critical for maintaining predictable commercial exchanges. Before these regulations, merchants in different regions often used different measuring units, leading to disputes and fraudulent practices. By introducing standardized weights and requiring their use in all trading activities, I created a unified economic environment. This increased trust in commercial exchanges and facilitated long-distance trade across regions newly integrated into the Babylonian system. One of the important intellectual works of my administration was the expansion and systematization of scribal training and textual preservation. The scribal schools, maintained in palaces and temples, trained new scribes using standardized lexical lists. That included vocabulary sets, administrative terminology, mathematical exercises, and legal formulas. These lists formed a structured curriculum that ensured consistency in scribal output. The copying of texts, both administrative and literary, ensured the preservation of technical knowledge. Much of what was recorded during my reign would later serve as reference material for subsequent generations. These activities represent institutional knowledge production rather than artistic creation. Diplomatic archives were also an important part of the intellectual output of my administration. Correspondence with Mari, Ashur, and other states was recorded in clay tablets that documented alliances, disagreements, espionage reports, troop movements, and economic negotiations. These texts allowed my administration to track regional political developments with precision. By maintaining written diplomatic records, the state ensured that decisions were based on verifiable information rather than oral transmission prone to inaccuracies. These diplomatic archives constitute a body of administrative literature produced to facilitate state functioning. Another category of my work involved adjustments to the organization of labor. Irrigation maintenance, canal excavation, agricultural production, construction, and administrative service required large and coordinated workforces. I implemented regulations defining how labor obligations were assigned, how workers were compensated, and how supervisors monitored their performance. These regulations were documented in official tablets and implemented consistently across the state. This system prevented labor shortages and ensured that essential public works were completed on schedule. I also supervised reforms concerning temple personnel and administrative officials. Officials and priests were assigned specific responsibilities, and penalties were established for misuse of resources or failure to perform duties. These measures standardized professional conduct and reduced the risk of corruption. In this context, my so-called works included not only physical structures or legal texts but also the systems governing human behavior within administrative institutions. The criminal classification system produced during my reign can also be considered one of my intellectual works. Crimes were categorized according to intent, economic impact, and potential to disrupt public order. This classification allowed penalties to be assigned in a consistent manner and reduced ambiguity for judges. The classification system distinguished between unintentional damage, negligence, and deliberate wrongdoing. These distinctions represent an administrative advancement. They provided a rational structure for legal analysis, enabling the state to handle disputes efficiently. Furthermore, the documentation of economic performance became more systematic. During my rule, tax receipts, land leases, labor rosters, storage inventories, irrigation output records, and agricultural yield reports were all maintained in organized archives. This expansion of documentation created an informational infrastructure that allowed the state to modify policies based on empirical data. For example, irrigation yields could be used to determine whether additional labor was required for canal maintenance. Similarly, storage inventories helped assess whether grain reserves were adequate for potential shortages. Astronomical observations conducted by temple scholars also played a role in administrative planning. Although I did not personally produce astronomical texts, the results of these observations were applied to adjust agricultural calendars. This improved the synchronization between planting cycles and seasonal changes. Any calculation that increased agricultural predictability indirectly contributed to the state's economic stability, and for that reason these observations can be considered part of the knowledge production system under my reign. Overall, all works associated with my rule were functional systems designed to maintain administrative coherence, economic stability, and legal uniformity across an expanding state. None of these works were produced for personal expression, they were created to address technical requirements. The legal corpus standardized judicial practice. The irrigation reforms protected agricultural production. The administrative reorganization ensured consistent operation across regions. The infrastructural works enhanced military and economic capacity. The standardization of weights and measures facilitated commerce. The preservation of text strengthened institutional memory. Together, these systems formed an integrated framework that supported the long-term stability of Babylon. Throughout my reign, the outcomes described as successes or failures were not the result of individual moments but the cumulative effect of structural processes, regional power dynamics, and administrative decision-making within the geopolitical environment of Mesopotamia. The conditions in which I governed were shaped by constant competition among states, shifting alliances, and economic constraints. My actions must therefore be understood as responses to these technical requirements, rather than expressions of personal triumph or loss. Each development described below reflects the operational functioning of a state seeking stability, expansion, and internal cohesion. One of the primary successes of my reign was the transformation of Babylon from a moderate regional state into the dominant power of Mesopotamia. This transformation was achieved through a combination of military operations, diplomatic coordination, and administrative restructuring. The defeat of Eshnunna represented a decisive shift in the eastern balance of power. By eliminating Eshnunna as a regional competitor, I secured control over the Diyala corridor, a strategically significant route connecting central Mesopotamia with the Zagros foothills and eastern trade networks. This development strengthened Babylon's access to resources and reduced the likelihood of encroachment from northeastern states. The conquest of Larsa constituted another major achievement. Larsa controlled the core agricultural zones of southern Mesopotamia, including extensive irrigation systems, grain reserves, and labor networks. By integrating Larsa into Babylonian administration, I consolidated the economic foundation of the entire region under a single governing structure. This expansion significantly increased the grain output available to the state and improved its long-term capacity to support military operations, taxation, and administrative functions. The integration of Larsa also required the replacement of local governance mechanisms with standardized procedures aligned with Babylonian norms. Once completed, this alignment produced a stable and efficient regional system. Diplomatic coordination with Mari formed an essential component of my strategic infrastructure. The tablets recovered from Mari demonstrate that our communication extended beyond ceremonial exchanges and involved detailed intelligence reports, military assessments, and strategic consultations. Mari's location along the Middle Euphrates made it a critical node for overseeing the western trade routes and monitoring political developments across Syria and the Levant. The information obtained through this diplomatic partnership contributed directly to my military planning against Ashnana and informed my decisions regarding potential threats from the West. However, the destruction of Mari, which occurred later as part of shifting political circumstances, represented both a short-term strategic necessity and a long-term loss of a valuable intelligence partner. Another success lies in my decision not to conduct a full conquest of Ashur. Instead, I employed a strategy of containment. Ashur was allowed to remain autonomous but not influential. This prevented the emergence of a new northern rival without requiring the expenditure of resources on a large-scale military campaign. Through controlled diplomatic relations, monitoring of trade activities, and local garrison placements along critical approaches, Babylon maintained strategic superiority while avoiding unnecessary losses. This approach demonstrates that military decisions were based on cost-benefit calculations rather than on territorial ambition. My legal reforms must be assessed as a structural success. By implementing uniform laws across all territories under my authority, I ensured consistency in judicial practices. This consistency improved predictability in economic transactions, reduced the incidence of disputes caused by unclear legal expectations, and strengthened the administrative coherence of the state. The legal system, as codified, structured society around defined responsibilities and measurable penalties, thereby reducing the burden on local officials to interpret situations independently. As a result, the judicial apparatus became more efficient and less susceptible to local variation or manipulation. Despite these successes, my reign also involved limitations and obstacles that cannot be omitted in an analytical account. The destruction of Mari, although strategically necessary under the circumstances, resulted in the loss of an established diplomatic network. Mari's archives provided detailed intelligence concerning regional politics, and the city's collapse created a temporary void in information flow across the western regions. Although replacement networks were established, they required time to develop, and during this period Babylon operated with reduced situational awareness. In certain areas, local resistance constituted another area of limited success. In cities newly integrated into the Babylonian administrative system, transitions were not always smooth. Some former elites attempted to retain influence or resist the standardization of legal and economic practices. This resistance occasionally caused disruptions in tax collection, labor quotas, and administrative compliance. Military garrisons and inspections were used to correct these problems, but complete integration required extended administrative oversight. These challenges highlight the difficulty of transforming regional systems deeply rooted in prior traditions. Environmental conditions also posed constraints. Periodic drought cycles affected agricultural output, despite the extensive irrigation regulations and engineering works implemented during my reign. When floods or insufficient rainfall disrupted harvests, tax revenues decreased and the economic pressure on farmers increased. Such conditions made Mesoram, debt release, decrees necessary. These decrees were technical interventions to restore economic balance by preventing excessive debt, accumulation that could weaken agricultural labor and destabilize social order. Although effective in preserving stability, their issuance demonstrates the limits of administrative control in the face of environmental variability. Logistical complications emerged during extended military operations, especially those conducted at considerable distances from Babylon. Long-distance campaigns required sustained supply chains, reliable water sources, and consistent transportation capacity. While logistical planning was comprehensive, certain circumstances, such as unexpected delays, terrain challenges, or fluctuating water availability, necessitated re-evaluation of initial plans. These issues occasionally extended the duration of campaigns and increased their resource demands. Nonetheless, these logistical challenges did not prevent overall success but illustrate the operational complexity of Mesopotamian warfare. Another obstacle involved the administrative workload generated by rapid expansion. The incorporation of new regions into the Babylonian state drastically increased the volume of records required to maintain accurate accounts of land ownership, taxation, labor assignments, and legal proceedings. To address this, new scribes had to be trained, administrative centers expanded, and local officials replaced or retrained to meet state standards. These adjustments required time and resources. The temporary shortages of skilled administrative personnel demonstrate that expansion placed stress on bureaucratic capacity, which had to be gradually increased to maintain stability. External political developments also introduced risks. Although Elam did not engage in direct conflict with Babylon during my reign, its activities were monitored continuously. Elam had historically intervened in Mesopotamian affairs and possessed military capabilities that could disrupt regional stability if not observed carefully. Allocating resources to monitor Elam's diplomatic and economic behavior constituted a necessary precaution but also highlighted the persistent vulnerability of Mesopotamian states to external actors. The most persistent source of conflict arose from the remnants of regional aristocracies in areas formerly controlled by Larsa. These groups had established local governance traditions that differed from those of Babylon. Transitioning them to the standardized administrative model required repeated audits, inspections, and legal enforcement actions. Incidents of resource mismanagement, unauthorized land use, or improper handling of temple assets were relatively common in the early years following annexation. Each incident required corrective measures and, in certain cases, the replacement of local officials. This process demonstrated the complexity involved in integrating large regions with pre-existing administrative cultures. From a strategic perspective, the long-term outcomes of my successes produced a centralized and coherent administrative state. The most influential success was not a single military victory but the establishment of a legal and administrative infrastructure that could govern diverse populations consistently. Military campaigns produced the territory necessary for expansion, but only the administrative reforms ensured that these gains were preserved across generations. The legal code supported standardized governance. The irrigation regulations protected agricultural capacity. The economic rules stabilized production. The organizational structure increased the efficiency of bureaucratic operations. Together, these systems constituted the durable core of the Babylonian state. In contrast, the limitations encountered during my reign primarily reflect structural constraints inherent to the physical environment, regional geopolitics, or the complexities of administrative transformation. These limitations were mitigated through technical adjustments, but they could not be entirely eliminated. For example, drought cycles remained an uncontrollable variable. Long-distance logistics continued to pose operational challenges. Cultural resistance from conquered regions required sustained administrative intervention. These issues do not diminish the accomplishments of my reign but indicate the boundaries within which any ruler of the period operated. The conflicts and threats I faced were therefore not the result of isolated hostile actors, but the predictable consequences of ruling within an interconnected system of states that competed for land, water, and trade. Babylon's success depended on altering that system in ways that favored stability under my authority. When the system shifted unfavorably, corrective measures were introduced. When opportunities emerged, strategic actions were taken to secure long-term advantage. The resulting balance reflects both the achievements facilitated by administrative capacity and the constraints imposed by environmental and geopolitical realities. These analyses indicate that my reign cannot be fully understood through singular events or simplified narratives. The successes were structural, the failures were systemic, and the conflicts were inherent to the conditions of the time. My actions were based on technical evaluation of resources, military feasibility, administrative capability, and political risk. The lasting influence of my reign derives from the systems I built, the regulations I implemented, and the stability created through coordinated governance rather than any personal or emotional motivations. At the end of my reign, my death did not result in an abrupt collapse of the administrative structure of the state. This outcome was the result of the long-term centralization policies, bureaucratic reforms, and institutional strengthening measures that had been implemented throughout my rule. These measures ensured that the state's mechanisms would continue functioning independently of my personal presence. Modern chronological reconstruction places the date of my death around 1750 BCE, based on king lists, administrative records, and the durations of reigns documented in later sources. Ancient texts do not present a dramatic or symbolic description of my death. Instead, the available evidence indicates that it occurred from natural causes, a common circumstance for rulers whose reigns extended over several decades. From an administrative perspective, the significance of my death lies not in its circumstances but in the structural continuity that followed. The stability of the state following my death demonstrates the degree to which institutional reforms have become embedded in the administrative framework. The central bureaucracy, expanded and standardized during my reign, was capable of sustaining governmental functions without immediate disruption. The judicial system continued to operate based on codified procedures. Taxation and economic administration proceeded along established guidelines. Temple institutions maintained their accounting responsibilities. Irrigation works remained organized according to documented labor obligations. These systems illustrate that the state had reached a stage where individual leadership transitions did not automatically provoke systemic breakdown. After my death, the throne passed to my son Samsoluna. The developments that occurred during his rule provide significant insight into the long-term effects of the systems I established. During his administration, several regions, particularly in the south, attempted to reassert local autonomy. These uprisings did not emerge because my administrative structures had failed, but because the regions in question retained deeply rooted traditions and prior political identities. During my reign, these tendencies had been managed through strong central oversight, military enforcement, and consistent administrative intervention. Once a new ruler ascended, these tensions resurfaced, demonstrating that governance required ongoing application of the principles and policies implemented earlier. My legacy must be evaluated through institutional, legal, administrative, and infrastructural contributions rather than through narratives of personal accomplishment. The most persistent and influential component of this legacy is the legal corpus produced during my reign. While modern audiences often emphasize the code's symbolic aspects, its primary function was administrative standardization. It defined penalties, responsibilities, and procedural norms for a wide range of social and economic scenarios. Its clarity and specificity made it an effective guideline for judges, governors, and administrative officials. The text provided uniformity across cities with differing traditions, reducing inconsistencies and increasing predictability in legal outcomes. For later societies and modern historians, the corpus serves as an extensive data source revealing the economic patterns, occupational expectations, and institutional relationships of old Babylonian society. Its endurance as a reference point reflects the systematic nature of its construction. My military legacy involves not only territorial expansion but also the strategic principles used to achieve and maintain control. The elimination of Eshnunna, the conquest of Larsa, and the containment of Ashur demonstrated the technical feasibility of combining military operations with economic and administrative integration. These actions produced a coherent political structure in which multiple regions were linked through shared legal norms, unified taxation, and coordinated irrigation systems. The underlying strategy involved identifying resource centers, analyzing logistical constraints, and deploying military operations in a phased sequence designed to minimize risk and maximize long-term administrative benefit. Subsequent rulers inherited an army that was better organized, more structured, and supported by improved logistical systems established during my reign. Administrative legacy is another essential component. The expansion of scribal institutions, the development of standardized accounting procedures, and the implementation of detailed record-keeping systems facilitated the transformation of Babylon into a complex bureaucratic state. Land distribution data, tax collection records, irrigation labor reports, judicial decisions, and commercial agreements were systematically documented. These records provided administrators with the information necessary to make informed decisions and allowed for monitoring and evaluation of regional performance. The creation of such an administrative infrastructure reduced reliance on informal local authority and increased state control over resources. In addition, the reorganization of temple economies established a model for integrating religious institutions into a centralized administrative framework. Temples retained their importance as economic centers, but their operations became more transparent and accountable. Regular reporting and audits ensured that temple resources were aligned with state requirements. This integration created a multi-level economic system in which state and temple finances were interconnected, contributing to greater stability in resource allocation. My contributions to irrigation and infrastructure management also shaped long-term state development. Irrigation was the foundation of Mesopotamian agricultural productivity. The canal cleaning campaigns, embankment reinforcements, and water channel redirections implemented during my reign set technical standards that endured beyond my lifetime. The explicit legal responsibilities assigned to farmers Laborers and local officials reinforced the importance of protecting irrigation systems. As a result, regions under Babylonian control were better able to maintain consistent agricultural output, which in turn supported taxation and labor distribution systems. These reforms did not eliminate environmental variability, but they improved the state's ability to adapt to seasonal challenges. Economic legacy can be assessed through the organization of taxation, labor allocation, land tenure, and commercial regulation. Standardized measures and weights reduced transactional discrepancies. Debt release decrees reduced the risk of economic collapse caused by overextension of credit. Land records clarified property rights and allowed for efficient distribution of agricultural responsibilities. The consistent application of these economic principles created a sustainable fiscal foundation for the state and influenced later administrative models. Diplomatic legacy is reflected in the way alliances and intelligence networks were used as strategic instruments. My partnership with Mari demonstrated that diplomacy could function as a data collection mechanism in addition to its role in negotiating alliances. Written correspondence documented military threats, troop mobilizations, economic fluctuations, and political developments across the region. This use of diplomacy as an informational tool provided a model for later states seeking to manage their external relations through systematic observation rather than sporadic negotiation. Modern historians interpret my legacy based on documentary evidence rather than speculative narratives. They emphasize the administrative rationality of my policies, the structural coherence of the legal system, and the effectiveness of military strategies in altering regional power dynamics. The legal corpus offers insights into contractual norms, property relations, labor conditions, and professional responsibilities. Economic records illustrate distribution systems, taxation procedures, and storage management. Diplomatic archives reveal how interstate relations were conducted and monitored. Archaeological evidence of irrigation networks, tablet archives, and administrative buildings supports conclusions about the structural complexity of the state during my reign. Following my death, the resurgence of local resistance in certain regions served to highlight the degree of centralization that had existed under my authority. The structures I built enabled later rulers to reassert control, though not without difficulty. Such resistance does not diminish the durability of my system, instead, it reflects the ongoing need for active governance in a diverse and expansive state. My reforms provided the tools necessary for administrative recovery, even when political circumstances became unstable. The technical legacy of my reign lies not in individual accomplishments but in the systems that redefined the functioning of the Babylonian state. Legal uniformity replaced fragmented local customs. Bureaucratic expansion increased record-keeping. Accuracy. Irrigation regulations protected agricultural productivity. Standardized taxation improved resource distribution. Military strategies combined territorial expansion with administrative consolidation. Together, these components formed a durable institutional framework that endured beyond my lifetime and influenced later periods of Mesopotamian governance. The evaluation of my legacy must therefore be grounded in the functional outcomes produced by these reforms. I established structures that strengthened the state's operational capacity, improved predictability in administrative processes, and ensured consistency in legal and economic systems. These achievements reflect a rational approach to governance that prioritized stability, efficiency, and continuity. My death marked the end of a reign, but the institutions built during my lifetime continued to shape the political and economic landscape of Mesopotamia for generations.